Video games. I'm sure that every single one of you has had at least one experience with video games. I remember my first experience with video games was playing Paper Mario in the basement of my friend's house on the GameCube. Video games have always interested me, not only because I play them, but also because they are a perfect way to see the improvement of technology over the years. For example, I'm sure a very large majority of you have had or at least played on a Wii before, and odds are you've also played Mario Kart. This is what Mario Kart on the Wii looked like back in 2008. Now, look at Mario Kart 8. The difference between the two is immense, and that's only within a 6-year period. Video games obviously didn't always look like the way they do, so let's take a look back into the past. The first video game was called Tennis for Two, also known as Pong. It was originally created on October 18th, 1958. Pong is a very simple game based on table tennis or ping pong. The game was created by Alan Alcorn when co-founder of Atari, Nolan Bushnell, assigned it to him as a training exercise. Bushnell based the idea on an electronic ping pong game. In June of 1972, Atari officially released Pong as an arcade cabinet. Although Pong was one of the first games made, it was not the first game released. One of the earliest games was called Space War. Space War was one of the first games released, all the way back in 1962. It involves two spaceships in a space battle. Both ships have access to torpedoes and a warp drive. Torpedoes are used to destroy the other ship, and the warp drive can be used to dodge the torpedoes. However, the more times you use the warp drive, the higher the chance of the ship being destroyed. Now, there are thousands of games out there and I can't go through them all, so here are some important ones. Magnavox released the Magnavox Odyssey in 1972, the first video game console which could be connected to a TV set. It's capable of displaying 3 square dots on the screen in monochrome black and white. The games themselves do not use ROM cartridges like later consoles such as the Atari or the Nintendo Entertainment System, but instead use game cards, composed of printed circuit boards that plug into the consoles. These cards modify the internal circuitry like a set of switches or jumpers, causing the Odyssey to display different components and react to inputs differently. Multiple games use the same cards, with different instructions given to the player to change the style of the game. Now this may seem very basic, but at the time it was revolutionary. Most games today are either downloaded on a computer or console or bought on a disc. However, before we got to this point, many other methods of storing video game data were used, starting with the Magnavox Odyssey, which I talked about before, using game cards. These game cards were useful because you could reuse certain game cards to be able to play multiple games. However, while games got more complex, the harder it is to program games with overlapping code. This means consoles after the Odyssey would only use one cartridge per game, with some exceptions. The next breakthrough would come with the use of CD-ROMs. One of the first to take advantage of this technology was Sony with the PlayStation 1 in 1994. The reason why this is important is because the maximum amount of storage a game cartridge used by something like the NES was about 1 megabyte. Now, the CD is able to store up to 700 times the amount of the NES cartridge. With modern day hard drives on the computer or new consoles, we can easily store 1 terabyte, which is over 1,000 times more storage than a CD. This means more games with more data are able to be stored on your devices. Most modern video games are 3-dimensional, unlike earlier games like Pac-Man or Super Mario Bros. So what game was the first 3D game? To determine that, we must define what 3D is. For this video, I will define 3D as using a texture that wraps around an object. For example, the first video game to achieve 3D was Quake, released in 1996. Quake used full 3D objects for all props and characters. Wolfenstein 3D came very close to achieving this, but it still relied on flat cards for characters. Now that we've learned about how video games have evolved to modern age, let's talk about the future of video games. Due to the technological advances of new graphics cards and virtual reality, video games are becoming more realistic each year. A good example of this is ray tracing. This might sound familiar, but if not, ray tracing is a rendering technique for generating an image by tracing the path of light as pixels in an image plane and simulating the effects of its encounters with the virtual objects. Normally, ray tracing would be done with a graphics card or a graphics processing unit, used to accelerate the speed of the computer. Keep in mind, this means millions of calculations are done per second, every second. This, as you can imagine, would be pretty hard for any computer to do. However, NVIDIA's GTX 20 series is here to save the day. When NVIDIA made their new graphics cards, they put an emphasis on the ray tracing component. NVIDIA calls this RTX. This means new games can be all the more realistic by simulating light in real time. Take this for example. Virtual reality is also a new technology that is already fascinating by itself, transporting you into a completely computer-generated world that you can use to talk to other people, experience amazing things, and go places that you would never be able to go in the real world. A big future exists for virtual reality, and if paired with RTX, it could make for some of the most realistic and technologically advanced video games to date, and we all started from this.